The wild bees came out of the rotting barn wall all at once, a black roar that boiled up out of the gray boards and spread across the yard like smoke catching fire, and every man on the roan place was already running. They ran low and they ran ugly, hats coming off, arms thrashing the air over their heads, one of them hollering a word that didn't mean anything, another going down hard on his knee in the dust and crawling for the open door of the bunkhouse. A horse screamed somewhere and tore loose. The sound the bees made was not a buzz. It was a pressure, a thing you felt in the teeth and behind the eyes. 10,000 small bodies furious at the daylight, and it rolled across that yard and bent every grown man in it like wheat. And into that cloud, while the hard men fled it, walked the bee-woman. Nellie Tarbox did not run. She was a big woman, broad through the back and heavy through the hip and shoulder, wide-armed and strong-handed, built like something meant to stand against weather, and the county that called her too much of everything had never once seen her use it for this. Her sun-browned forearms were bare to the swarm, and she did not so much as roll a sleeve to cover them. She carried only a battered tin smoker, and she worked it slow, squeezing the little bellows so a thread of cool gray smoke unspooled from the spout. And she moved into the worst of the cloud, the way a person walks into a creek, certain of the bottom, planting each foot down and certain of the next. She did not flinch, she did not swat. A bee can smell fear on a body the way a dog can, and there was none on hers to smell. She breathed the smoke out ahead of her impatient pulses, and she made a low sound in her chest, almost a hum, the sound a mother makes over a fevered child, and the fury came down a half tone, then another, the bees folding their anger into the smoke, as if she'd reached up into the air and turned some screw at the center of the storm. Then she put out one heavy arm, steady as a fence rail, level as a shelf, and she waited. And the swarm, the same swarm that had grown men crawling in the dirt, gathered itself up out of the air and settled onto her sleeve in a slow living drape. A pound of bees, and then two, hanging soft and quiet from her wrist like she called them home, and they had only been waiting to be asked. The yard went still. The men stood off at the edges of it, breathing hard, and stared at the fat bee-woman they had been laughing at an hour before, and not one of them came any closer. If you want to know how a woman the whole town wrote off ends up standing in the middle of that with a swarm tame on her arm and not one man left brave enough to stand beside her, then do me one kindness before we go on. Follow along and stay to the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far Nellie's story travels tonight. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and we'll carry Nellie all the way through together, because that is the last I'll ask of you. From here, we tell it straight through, no more interruptions, just the story. And to tell it right, we have to go back before the swarm, back before any man on that ranch had cause to be ashamed of himself, to a cold week earlier and a notice tacked to a post outside the Mercantile in Cedar Gap, Colorado. The paper had been there long enough to gray at the corners, curling where the tacks let go, and the wind off the high country worried it back and forth, so the bottom edge ticked against the wood. Folks had walked past it for a week and left it alone. The hand that wrote it had not wasted ink. Wild bees gone, it said. Room and board. No references required. Nellie read it twice, standing in the cold rut of the street with her bundle on her shoulder, and it was that last line that held her fast, the way a starving person's eye holds on bread in a window. No references required. She had none to give. She had no family living, none anywhere above the ground, no letter from a former employer folded soft in a pocket, no name in that town or any town behind her that a body could send a man to ask after. What she had, she carried on her, and it was not much to the eye. The patched butternut brown work dress gone thin at the elbows, the heavy canvas apron with its deep pockets, the folded length of fine netting, the battered tin smoker, and 2 strong arms. That was the whole of her inheritance in this world. 2 arms, a steady character no one had ever asked to inspect, and a craftsman's reed of bees and bloom and weather that lived deep in her hands, and nowhere a person passing on the street could see it. Everything else the world had either taken from her or never thought to give. She had no roof of her own and no coin to rent one. She had slept 2 nights up in the livery loft on the keeper's grudging charity, paying him in mucked stalls and mended harness, and she knew without asking that she could not ask a third. The cold was coming down hard out of the high country, and a woman alone with winter, coming and no place to be in it, does not have the luxury of pride or particulars. So the want in her was a simple, hard, narrow thing, and she did not dress it up or pretty it over, even to herself. She wanted a roof over her head before the snow. She wanted a chance, just one, to prove the single true thing she knew how to do. The notice on that post promised both to anyone fool enough or desperate enough to walk out into the hills and earn them, and Nellie Tarbox was not a fool. She was only desperate, and desperate she could work with. She reached up and tore the paper down off the post, folded it once and slid it into her apron pocket, and stepped inside to ask the mercantile man which road. He looked at her a long moment over the counter, taking in the size of her and the worn dress and the smoker hooked at her hip, and something passed over his face that she had learned long ago to see coming and to let go past her like water off oilcloth. "Rome Place," he said finally, as if the words cost him something. "Cedar Gap Road, out past the creek crossing. You'll know it by the barn falling down." Then, lower, half to himself, as she gathered her bundle and turned to go. "He'll not pay you. There's no money out at the Roan place to pay anybody. Hasn't been for 2 years. She heard him. She went anyway. She walked it. It was the better part of an hour on a rising road, the town dropping away behind her, and the country opening up gray and gold and tired on every side, late-season grass laid flat by the wind, fence lines sagging where no one had set a new post in a long string of years. The cold worked through her dress, and she paid it no mind. She walked slow and certain, the way she did everything, never hurried and never stopped, and she did not pause to rest, though the long climb pulled hard at the heavy strength of her, because resting was a luxury, and she had spent her last of those nights ago in the livery loft. Her bundle rode her shoulder, the smoker ticked at her hip. She read the land as she went, the way she read everything. Out of long habit, she could not have switched off if she tried. The slope of it, the bloom that would come up out of it when the season turned, the alder and the wild clover bedded down for winter along the creek, the way the light fell and what the wind was doing. There was good bee country here under the neglect, she thought. Somebody had stopped seeing it. She smelled the ranch before she fully saw it, wood smoke gone thin and stretched, and under it, threading through it, the particular sweetness she would have known blindfolded In a dark room 100 miles from anywhere, the heavy gold smell of honey and warm rendered wax leaking out of somewhere it had no earthly business being. Her step did not quicken, but something in her chest leaned toward it. Then the place itself came up over the last rise, and she stopped after all, and stood and looked a long while before she went down. The Roan ranch was dying. There was no kinder word for what spread out below her in the failing light. The house had been a good house once and was still sound enough in the bones, but it wore its neglect like a long, slow illness wears a body. A shutter hanging crooked by one nail, the porch step splintered, a water trough gone green. And beside the house, the kitchen garden, gone entirely over to weed and ruin, and that was the thing that caught at her and held, though she could not have said why. The beds were still squared off in their neat, planted rows, the little stick markers still standing at the heads of them, so plain you could see a careful and loving hand had laid the whole of it out and tended it and taken pride in it, and then simply stopped. 2 seasons back, by the look, all at once, as if the person who'd kept that garden had set down the hoe one ordinary afternoon and walked away, and never once come back for it, and nobody else had had the heart to so much as pull a weed in the ground where she'd worked. Nellie did not know yet whose hand it had been. She only knew the shape of that kind of stopping, and it sat cold in her stomach. The corral below held a few head of cattle, lean where there should have been many more. A thin line of sheep moved gray against the far slope, unshorn, their wool grown past its season. The whole place had the look of a thing running out of money, out of hands, out of time. And the barn was the worst of it, and the truest. It leaned. One whole corner of it had given up the fight and was sliding slow toward the earth. The great board sprung and silvered with weather, and down the side of it ran a long black seam where the wood had rotted clean through and fallen open. From deep inside that seam came a low, steady hum that Nellie felt in her chest before her mind put the name to it, and out of it and into it ran a thin, tireless traffic of dark specks, threading the cold, bright air, working as if the whole world around them were not coming down. Bees, wild bees, and a great host of them, had found the dying heart of this place and moved into it and made it their own. She stood there on the rise, with that gold smell of honey in her nose and that deep hum settling into her bones, and she understood the whole of the job, and a good deal more than the job, before a living soul had told her one word of any of it. She came down off the rise and into the yard, and a man came out onto the porch and watched her come. He did not wave. He did not call out any greeting. He stood with one shoulder set against the post and waited, unhurried, for her to close the whole of the distance herself. And the nearer she came, the more of him she could read, though all there was to read was a door shut and bolted and the key thrown away. He was tall and lean and weather-cut, mid-30s by the look, and older than that around the eyes, dressed in a worn duster and scuffed boots, a flat-brimmed hat pulled low against the cold, a dark beard cropped close to the jaw, going gray along the line of it, and gray eyes, pale, level, giving back nothing at all, not unfriendly and not friendly either, just shut. The eyes of a man who had stopped some time ago expecting anything good to come walking up his road. This, she would learn soon enough, was Silas Rowan, and the ranch wore his name the way the barn wore its rot. The Roan place, the Roan ranch, the one word doing for the man and the land and the trouble all three. He looked her over slow, the way the mercantile man had, the way every one of them always did, the size of her and the worn brown dress and the smoker on her hip, and she stood square in the yard and let him look his fill, hands quiet at her sides, breathing slow and even. She had the folded notice down in her apron pocket, and she did not bother to take it out and wave it at him. The barn behind his shoulder hummed its low note. The dead garden lay off to the side of them both. Somewhere inside that shut-up house was a grief he would not say the name of, and a small wary child she had not yet laid eyes on, and a few of a dead woman's things gathering dust, and somewhere in the town behind her was a smooth, well-fed man holding a paper that could take the whole of this away with a single called word. But Nellie Tarbox knew none of that yet, not one piece of it. She knew only the bees and the roof and the chance, and that was enough to walk a body the last few steps across a cold yard to a cold man. "I've come about the notice," she said, "the wild bees." He looked at her a long moment more, and the silence stretched, and she let it. Then he straightened up off the post, and whatever it was that moved behind that gray, level face moved too far down in him for her to follow it from where she stood in the yard. "It's hard work," he said at last. "Dangerous, by the look of that wall. And there's no wages in it, not till the place earns again, if it ever does. Room and board is the whole of what I've got to offer, and that's poor enough." "I read the paper," Nellie said. "I'll take the work." And the cold man and the dying ranch and the leaning barn full of wild bees stood there together in the last of the failing afternoon light and made her no promise at all, none beyond the only one she had walked all that way to hear, a roof over her head against the coming snow, and a chance, just the one, to show what her two strong arms could do. Silas Roan looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he has not yet decided to buy. His gray eyes moved over her once, over the broad set of her shoulders and the heavy strength of her arms and the deep canvas apron with its pockets, and whatever he made of it stayed shut behind his face. Tall he was, and lean, weather-cut down to rope and bone, a dark, close-cropped beard going gray along the jaw, and a flat-brimmed hat throwing his eyes into shadow. And he stood on the porch of his own house like a man standing guard over something he no longer believed could be saved. "You're the one wrote back about the bees," he said. It was not a question. Nellie set her tin smoker down on the porch board and let the folded netting hang from her wrist. "Nellie Tarbox," she said, "I read your notice in Cedar Gap." He did not offer his hand. The wind came off the open land behind him, dry and smelling of dust and old hay, and somewhere past the house the collapsing barn leaned into it, the wild hum still threading out of the rotting wall like a low note no one in the yard could turn off. She had heard that hum the moment she stepped down from the wagon, before she had seen a soul on the place, and her hands had wanted to go to it the way another woman's hands might go to a crying child. "The notice said, 'Clear the hive,'" Silas said. "Room and board while you do it. No references. That's the whole of it." "I read it plain," she said. "Then we're agreed." He turned half away toward the door, the worn duster moving against his legs, and that was meant to be the end of the talking. There was no welcome in it. There was nothing in it at all but the work and the price of the work, and Nellie, who had crossed a long road on the strength of 2 arms and a steady character, understood that she had not been hired so much as permitted, and that the difference would have to be earned out here in the open where everyone could watch her fail. She had expected as much. A woman the county had called too much of everything learned early not to wait on softness. She had walked off the last of 3 places before this one with nothing owed her and nothing owing, and she had learned on each of them to set her own worth quietly inside her, where no one's opinion could get at it, and to let the work do the speaking that her face and her arms could not. What she had not expected was the girl. The child stood in the doorway behind her father, small and watchful, pale hair pulled into 2 thin braids, a wary closed thing of about 9, looking up at the big stranger on the porch. There was a red welt risen on the back of one small hand, fresh, angry, the kind a sting leaves, and the way the girl held that hand cradled against her pinafore told Nellie the whole of it before a word was said. The child had been near the wall. The child had been hurt by the very thing Nellie had come to take away, and now she stared at Nellie with the bees and the netting and the smoker as if all of it were one creature, and Nellie were its keeper. There was no mother at the girl's shoulder to draw her back from the doorway, nor to have salved that sting, Nellie noticed, and noticed, too, that the child stood the way children stand who have learned to look after their own small hurts in a house where the grown grief takes up all the room. Nellie knew the look. She had worn it herself at that age, in a house gone quiet for its own reasons, and the recognition moved in her quick and unwelcome, and she set it down where she set most things, behind the work. "Jess," Silas said, not unkindly but flat, "inside." The girl went, slow, her eyes not leaving Nellie until the dark of the house took her, and Silas did not explain her and did not soften, and Nellie filed it away with the rest of what she was beginning to read off this place. She had a craftsman's habit of reading a thing whole before she touched it, the way she would stand under a humming wall and listen until she knew the temper of the bees inside it. And she read the Roan Ranch now the same way, slow, taking its measure, the rusted hinges that wept orange down the doorframe, the corral rail gone silver and split where no one had troubled to true it, the cattle strung thin and shaggy across the far pasture, more bone than beef, grazing land that had been let go hard and dry, and against the south wall of the house, where the morning sun would have fallen best, a kitchen garden gone all to weed and seed head, the rows still faintly there under the ruin of them, the way a made bed shows under a year of dust. Someone had knelt in that dirt once and kept it well by the shape of what was left, and then one day had stopped, and no one had knelt there since. There were a few things on the porch besides, a child's small chair, a dented watering can stood by the rail going to rust. That had the look of belongings nobody could quite bring themselves to put away nor to use. She did not ask about the woman who had kept that garden. You did not ask such a thing of a man whose quiet sat on him the way this one's did, a quiet the town would later tell her was coldness, but that she had already begun to suspect was something nearer to a wound he kept his hand pressed over so it would not be seen to bleed. She saw the garden, and she saw how his eyes went past it without landing, the way a body learns to look past a thing that still cuts, the glance sliding off it fast and going hard, and she let it lie. Whatever grief lived on this place had a name and a date and a patch of ground gone to seed, and it was not hers to turn over. She only marked where it was, the way she would mark a wasp's nest under an eave, and stepped around it. Out by the corral, an old hand was watching the whole exchange and not pretending otherwise. He was grizzled and bow-legged, well past 60 by the look of him, a tobacco-stained gray mustache hiding most of his mouth, and he leaned on the top rail favoring one knee and then the other, while he sized her up with the flat, unimpressed squint of a man who had seen a great many fool notions blow through on the Cedar Gap road. He spat to the side. He said nothing to her face at first. But when Silas had gone in and Nellie bent to gather her smoker, she heard him say to no one in particular, easy and dry, "Hive's been in that wall 3 summers. Took 2 men with coal oil and a ladder last year, and they come down stung blind and the bees still there." He let that sit. "Reckon she'll talk 'em out." She straightened, the smoker in her hand, and looked at him plain, not angry. "Coal oil makes 'em mad," she said. "You don't fight bees. You ask 'em." The old man's squint did not change, but his head tipped a degree, the way a dog's will at a sound it has not heard before. "Ask 'em," he repeated, flat like a man trying the weight of a fool's coin. "Ask 'em." He shifted off the rail, easing his bad knees one and then the other, and shook his head and went on about his business, and that was the whole of it. But she had seen the tip of the head, and she stored it. That was Gideon, though she did not have his name yet, only the shape of his doubt, and his doubt was honest at least, which was more than she would get in town. He thought her a fool, the way every hard man on a hard place thought a new thing a fool until it proved otherwise. But he had said it to her face and not behind her, and on the strength of 2 strong arms and a long road, she had learned to tell the difference between a man who scorned you and a man who only doubted you, and to know that the second kind could be won. She got the name, and a good deal worse the next morning, when Silas sent her into the Cedar Gap Mercantile for lamp oil and a keg of nails and whatever wax pots and screening she meant to make her skeps from. And the town got its first long look at the bee-woman from the Roan place. They did not trouble to lower their voices. Cedar Gap was a one-street town of false fronts and dust, and a bank at the head of it, and word of who had come to the Roan place had plainly run the length of that street before her wagon did. A knot of men outside the feed store watched her come up the rutted way in her patched butternut dress with the smoker still riding her apron belt, and one of them, a lean fellow with a quid in his cheek, said loud enough to carry, "That what Roan brought home? My God, he needed a hand, not a whole haystack with a bonnet on it." The laughter went round easy and ugly. Another spat and added, "Reckon he'll save on cattle feed then. Turn her out in the pasture." A woman on the boardwalk, basket on her arm, looked Nellie up and down and pulled her skirts a half-inch aside as if size were a thing that might smudge off. "However'd she get up the wagon?" the woman said to her companion not quietly. "2 strong arms," Nellie said to her, pleasant, not stopping, "and a wagon built for work." That earned a sharper laugh from the men, this time half at the woman's expense, and Nellie took her parcels and her dignity both, and kept walking, slow and certain, never flinching, because flinching was the one thing that fed them. She had been the largest thing in every doorway she had ever stood in, and she had long since stopped letting strangers tell her what that was worth. Let them count her at a haystack. A haystack, she thought, settling the keg of nails in the crook of one arm as easily as another woman would carry a loaf, was a winter's worth of keeping a thing alive, and there was not a man laughing on that boardwalk who could lift the half of what she carried now without a second pair of hands. But the worst of Cedar Gap was not loud at all. The worst of it was waiting by the bank in a good gray hat and a town suit cut well across a well-fed frame. Soft, pale hands folded one over the other, watching her with an easy smile that put her in mind of a man counting something. He stepped down off the bank steps as she passed, unhurried, the picture of a gentleman, and touched his hat brim. "You'll be the new help out at the Roan place," he said. "Word does travel." His voice was warm and reasonable, a banker's voice, the kind made to put a body at ease while it took the measure of what they had to lose. "Hollis, Vane, I hold some of the paper out that way." He let his eyes go over her once, leisurely, and the smile never moved while he did it. "I'll own I'm surprised. Silas Roan's a man pinched down to nothing, and he spends his last good board on feeding." The smile widened to hair, gentle as butter. "Well, the most of a woman I've seen come through Cedar Gap in a year. A man that far behind ought to count his portions closer than that." It was said so mildly, with such a show of friendly concern, that a stranger might have missed the knife in it altogether. Nellie did not miss it. She looked at the soft, pale hands and the good hat, and the smile that never once reached the eyes, and she understood that this man was the most dangerous thing she had met since she stepped off the road. More dangerous than the swarm in the wall by a long mile, because the swarm meant her no harm, and this one did, and dressed it up as kindness. "I eat what I earn, Mr. Vane," she said. "And I earn. I'm sure you do." He stepped back, all courtesy, opening the way for her as though he had done her a service. "It's only a place that far under water, a note that comes due. A body hates to see good money go to a lost cause. You'll want to be paid in coin and not promises, is my friendly advice. The Roan ranch is a sinking thing. No sense going down with it." He paused, and something in the pause was meant for her to fill, and when she did not, he supplied it himself, gentle as ever. "Silas Roan owes this bank more than that land will fetch at auction, and the note falls due before the snow. That's no secret in Cedar Gap. A man can't make wool sell that nobody will buy, nor cattle neither, and I'd not want a hard-working woman to learn too late she'd hitched her wagon to a wreck." It was the kind thing a friend might say. It had not one warm word too few, nor too many. And under it, laid down so smooth a body might have walked across it without knowing, was the plain shape of a man telling her he had decided already how the Roan place would end, and that he could afford to be patient about it because he held the paper that would make it so. He touched his hat again and let her by, and the warmth of it followed her down the boardwalk like a hand laid flat between the shoulder blades. So that was the shape of it, she thought, loading the wagon in the thin spring sun. There was the note Vane held over the place, come due or coming, the broken thing the ranch could not fix. There was the cold widower who would not name his grief and let his dead wife's garden stand in weeds rather than speak of it. There was the wary, stung child who watched the bees like a wolf at the door. There was an old hand who thought her a fool and a town that thought her a joke. And there was Vane himself, smiling, patient, already circling, waiting with a banker's good manners for the whole place to go under so he could be there, reasonable and regretful, to pick it up. Nellie Tarbox climbed up onto her wagon, built for work, took the reins in her strong brown hands, and turned the team back toward the Roan road. They had hired her to make some bees gone. That was all any of them wanted of her, and she meant to give them a great deal more than they had bargained for. She did not clear the hive. That was the first thing they got wrong about her, and she let them go on being wrong about it for the better part of a week, because she had learned long ago that a frontier town would rather watch a woman fail than listen to her plan. The morning after she came, Nellie Tarbox walked out to the collapsing barn with the gray light still low and wet on the grass, and she stood a long while in front of the rotting wall where the wild colony hummed inside the punky timber, and she did not reach for an axe or a torch or a bucket of coal oil. She reached for her ear instead. She set the flat of her broad hand against the split board and felt the colony work behind it, a deep, dry roar with no anger in it yet, the sound of 50,000 creatures keeping a city warm. And she nodded once, slow, the way a person nods at a thing that is exactly as bad and exactly as good as she had guessed. Burning them out would have been the easy thing. It would have been the thing Silas Roan had hired her to do. Wild bees gone, the notice had said, in a hand that did not waste words. And any drifter with a smoker and no conscience could have smoked that colony stupid, knocked the wall in, and shoveled the dead comb out by noon for the room and the board, and a coin pressed flat in the palm. Nellie meant to do the harder thing and call it the same name, because the harder thing was the one that turned a nuisance in a dying man's barn into money he did not yet know he had. So she started building, and she let them watch. She built the steps first, in the lee of the barn where the wind came soft, sitting on an upturned crate, with her heavy canvas apron spread across her lap like a workbench. She had carried the coiled rice straw in on her back, the way some women carried their whole dowry, and now she worked it in long ropes, binding the coils round and round with split bramble canes she had cleaned of thorns by lamplight the night before, her strong hands turning the dome up out of nothing, the wide base, the narrowing shoulder, the small dark mouth at the top, where the bees would later murmur in and out. It was slow work, and it did not look like much from the porch, a big sun-browned woman in a patched butternut dress winding straw in the cold, and she heard the first of it come across the yard on the second day, two of the hands leaning on the corral rail with their coffee, not bothering to drop their voices. "That's the bee woman," one said. "Roan's bee woman. Took one look and figured she could outsit a barn full of bees." "More of her to sting," the other said, and laughed, and the first one laughed with him, and somebody by the bunkhouse door took it up. "Reckon they couldn't find all of her at once." Nellie did not look up from the straw. The narrator of her own long life had taught her that the cruelty was never about the bees, and never really about her size either. Not truly. It was about a man with nothing in his pockets needing someone lower than himself to stand on, and she had been that low rung for so many men in so many towns that the words went through her now like wind through a fence. She wound the coil. She bound the cane. Her wide arms did not so much as pause, and that steadiness, that refusal to flinch or flush or fire back, was its own kind of answer, the kind that made the laughter trail off because there was nothing in her to push against. By the time she set the finished skiff on its board, golden and tight and humming ready in the weak sun, the corral rail had gone quiet, and one of the men had wandered off to find work he could be seen doing. Old Gideon was the one who could not stay away. He came bow-legged across the yard the third morning, with his bad knees swinging him side to side, his tobacco-stained gray mustache working over some private judgment. And he stood off at a careful distance with his thumbs in his belt and watched her open the wall. She had spent 2 days reading the colony before she touched it, pressing her palm to the wood at dawn and dusk to feel which way the warmth pooled, marking with a nub of charcoal where the comb hung heaviest behind the board, learning the door the bees used and the false door they ignored. Now she fired the battered tin smoker with a twist of dry punk and rotted burlap until it breathed a cool blue thread, and she puffed it soft and patient into the seams of the wall, not to drive the bees mad, but to make them think the world was ending the gentle way, so they would go down into the comb and gorge on honey and forget to be afraid. The roar behind the board changed pitch. It dropped. It went from the high, bright note of a colony on guard to the low, full drone of a colony with its mouth full, and Nellie laid her ear to the wood one last time, satisfied, and began to pry the rotten board free with a flat bar, slow, an inch at a breath. The comb came out into the light in great pale gold sheets, heavy as wet wool, and the bees boiled up over her bare forearms in a living brown glove and did not sting her. And Gideon swore softly and took a step back, and then did not take another. She worked the comb down with a long knife, brood comb here, dark and rubbery and crawling with the colony's future, honeycomb there, capped white and dripping at the broken edge, and she did not crush it and pale it the way the wreckers did. She tied it. She cut the good brood comb into clean sheets and bound each sheet into a wooden frame with strips of soft cloth, fitting them down into the first hive box she had nailed together from barn boards too sound to be rotten, so that the colony came out of the wall not as a ruined heap, but as a city-moved house, queen and brood and stores all carried over in their own combs, set down whole in a box that stood up off the ground on legs where a man could tend it. By the time the sun was high, she had the bulk of them shifted, the new box murmuring and orienting in slow gold circles in the air before it, the queen somewhere safe in the dark middle of it, and the old wall standing empty and astonished behind her. Gideon came close then, closer than any sane old man came to 40,000 loose bees, and squatted on his bad knees to look into the open box where the bees were already festooning down to mend the seams she had made. "I seen men burn 'em," he said, to the box more than to her. "I seen men drown 'em in a barrel, never seen a soul walk one out of a wall and set it up keeping house." He worked his mustache. He squinted up at her, the big, plain, square-jawed woman, standing easy in her veil thrown back, the smoker breathing in her fist. "You done this afore." "My whole life," Nellie said. "There wasn't much else left to me." He grunted. It was not approval, not yet, but it was the sound a hard man makes when a thing he expected to dismiss has refused to be dismissed, and Nellie had heard that sound turn into loyalty often enough to know it for the first crack in the ice. From that morning, Gideon found reasons to be near the hives. He brought her the sound barn boards before she asked. He showed her the spring on the property's far line where the water ran sweet, and the bottom acres where the clover had gone wild and waist-high in the years the place had been let slide, and when she stood looking at that neglected clover, with her hand shading her eyes, he saw what she saw a half-beat after she said it. "That's a honey crop standing right there going to waste," she said. "Nobody's run stock on it. Nobody's cut it. That's the richest thing on this ranch, and the man doesn't know he owns it." Gideon looked at the clover and looked at the new hive and looked at her, and for the first time he did not look skeptical. He looked like a man doing sums. The days stacked one on the next, the way good work always stacks, each one laying a course on the one before it, and the small wins came so quietly that a person had to be paying attention to count them. The second box filled, and she split it, lifting frames of capped brood across into the empty third box, with the bare-handed care of a woman turning a sleeping infant, and the colony took the split without sulking, and started 2 cities where there had been one. She found a swarm cell on the underside of a frame one bright morning, the colony making itself a new queen, the surest sign in the world of a hive grown rich and crowded and content, and she showed it to Gideon on the tip of her knife. The long peanut-shaped cell with the royal grub curled inside, and the old man took off his hat to look at it the way he might have taken his hat off in a church. She caught the cast swarm 3 days later when it boiled up out of the box and hung in the wild plum like a great dark fruit, and she did the thing again that had undone the whole yard the first week, walked in under it bare-armed, set a clean skep upturned beneath the cluster, and gave the branch one short, sure shake so the swarm dropped into the straw in a single soft avalanche and stood there easy in the falling bees until the last of them marched up into the dark of the skep and the air went quiet. 2 of the younger hands watched that one from the safe side of the corral and did not laugh. There was nothing in it to laugh at. There was only a big, steady woman making more out of a dying ranch every single day with her 2 strong arms and a length of netting and a rate on the bees that none of them could have bought at any price. She rendered a second batch of wax and a third, and the cakes of clean gold beeswax stacked up on the kitchen windowsill like coin minted out of summer. She built the frames in the evenings while the wax cooled, boring the holes and stringing them with fine wire pulled tight as a fiddle string. Embedding the thin sheets of foundation, she pressed herself in a wooden mold Gideon helped her carve, so that the bees would build straight, clean comb on a guide instead of wild bridging that broke and dripped and wasted. Every frame was a little machine for making money, and she built them by the dozen, her strong hands sure in the lamplight, until the lean stack against the barn was no longer the makings of 3 boxes, but of 6, then 8. She tended the colony in all weathers and read the sky for it like a second language, closed the hive entrances small against a cold snap that came through one night and was gone by noon, threw a weighted board over the boxes when a hail squall walked across the bottom acres and spent itself, propped the lids for air on the still hot afternoons when the bees hung bearded out the front of the box fanning to keep their wax from slumping. She lost a queen to a careless minute and grafted a new one from the swarm cells before the colony even knew its grief. And that small invisible rescue, a thing no one on the place but Gideon understood the size of, was the kind of win that never showed and mattered most. She read the bloom the way the town read the Bible, daily and out loud to anyone who'd listen, which for a while was only Gideon and the bees. She knew the wild plum had thrown its early white and gone over. She knew the clover on the bottom was 3 weeks from its flood, and the sage on the dry slope behind it would carry the flow another month past that, and the late aster down in the draws would close the season out in September, if the frost held off. She walked the land at the cool ends of the days with the netting folded over her shoulder, naming what grew, pressing blossoms between her fingers to read how heavy they ran, sniffing the wind for rain. She moved slow and certain over ground the rest of them had given up on, and she carried in her head a calendar no one else on the place could see, a whole season of bloom laid out like a ledger, and the bees, the hands that would turn it into coin. The reckoning she did in the evenings, by the kitchen lamp, when the work was done. She had a stub of pencil and a few sheets of brown paper she'd begged off Gideon, and she sat at the corner of the table the family did not use and worked the figures the way she worked the straw, slow and tight and leaving no loose end. So many frames to a box, so much capped honey to a frame at the height of the clover flow, so many boxes she could build and stock before the bottom bloomed. She wrote the numbers small and stacked them in columns. Pounds of honey on this side, pounds of wax on that. And beside them, in a third column, the prices she had carried in her memory out of 3 counties. What comb honey fetched by the section in a town with a railhead. What strained honey brought by the gallon to a hotel or a baker. What clean rendered beeswax was worth to a candlemaker or a saddler or a woman who sealed her own jars. The columns grew down the page. She added them twice to be sure, the way you check a knot that has to hold weight. And then she sat back and looked at the bottom figure for a long time in the lamplight, her broad face still, because the bottom figure was larger than the called note. She had heard the size of the note. It had been in the town's mouth before she'd been on the place 3 days. The thing Hollis Vane was said to hold over the roan land like a slow noose. And here, on her brown paper, in pencil, was a number that could pay it, if the season held, if the bloom came in, if a man with no reason left to hope would let a stranger build him something out of straw and bees and patience. She folded the paper and put it in the deep pocket of her apron and told no one yet. It was too big a thing to say out loud to people who had already decided what she was. The wax she could not keep to herself, because the wax made things, and things were what a frightened motherless child could be reached through. Jessamine Roan, Jess, 9 years old and small and watchful, her dead mother's pale hair in 2 thin braids, a child who flinched at the bees because one had stung her once and no one had ever taught her the difference between a sting and a sentence. Jess had kept to the far side of the yard since Nellie came, the way a wary cat keeps to the wall. But there is no child alive who can keep away from the smell of beeswax rendering. Nellie set the old cappings and the broken bits of comb into a kettle of water over a low fire behind the kitchen, and as the wax melted and rose and the water went gold beneath it, the whole back of the house filled with a smell that was honey and warm grass and church candles and summer all at once, and Jess drifted in on it from the wall the way the bees drifted to the clover, until she was standing in the kitchen door with one thin braid in her fist, not coming closer, not going away. "It smells like a flower that's also a candle," Jess said, suspicious of her own words, as if she had not meant to speak at all. "That's about the whole truth of it," Nellie said, and did not turn around fast or coax or fuss, only kept skimming the clean gold wax off the top of the water with a wooden spoon and pouring it into the little molds she'd carved from a chunk of soft wood, molds for tapers, molds for a fat squat candle that would burn all evening, molds for cakes of salve. "Bees make the wax to build their house. We just borrow it back once they're done with the bits they don't need." She let the silence sit. Easy, the way she let the silence sit with a colony. "You can pull the candles when they're hard, if you've a mind. That's the best part. Nobody ought to miss the best part. It took just 2 evenings to take the offer, and when she did, she came to the table so carefully that Nellie pretended great interest in the fire, and the child turned the first cooled taper out of its mold into her own small hand and held it up to the lamp. A perfect pale spiral with the smell of summer baked into it, and something crossed the child's closed-off little face that had not been there since Nellie came. A plain, uncomplicated wanting. The look of a child who has found a thing she is good at. After that, Jess came every evening. She cut the wicks to length with great solemnity. She turned the candles. She learned to stir the salve, beeswax, and rendered tallow, and a little of the dark wild honey worked in until it set up smooth in its tins. The salve that Nellie meant to sell for chapped hands and cracked heels, and the burns and scrapes a working county, was never without. The child's wariness did not vanish all at once. It went the way frost goes off a window in patches from the warm corner outward. But she stopped flinching from the bees. Nellie took her out one still evening to stand a careful 10 feet from the hive and watch the foragers come in heavy-legged and gold with pollen, and name the colors of the loads for her: pale yellow off the clover, gray-green off the sage, dusty orange off something blooming in the draws, until the bees stopped being a danger to the child and became a wonder instead, which is the only cure for that particular fear there has ever been. And through all of it, across the stacking days, Nellie felt the weight of being watched, and knew without looking up most times whose watching it was. Silas Roan said almost nothing to her past what the work required. He was tall and lean and weather-cut, his dark beard going gray at the jaw. His gray eyes give him back nothing, and the town had long since decided that nothing was all there was behind them. He had hired her to clear a hive, and she had not cleared it. She had built him an apiary instead. 3 boxes now, and the makings of 3 more leaned against the barn, and a stranger might have thought a man would be angry at a bargain so thoroughly rewritten under his nose. But Silas was not a stranger to his own land, whatever the town thought, and Nellie marked the change in him the only way the world ever let her mark it. From the outside, from the porch, across the yard, in the small unsayable things a closed man does when he thinks no one is reading him. The morning she carried the comb out of the wall hole, he had come to the barn door and stood there with his hat in his hand, and something behind his face had adjusted, some setting moved by a notch, gone again, before she could name it. He began to find work near the hives. He mended the corral on the side that faced the apiary when the far side needed it worse. Once she came around the barn and found him simply standing in front of the new boxes with his hands at his sides, watching the foragers map their slow gold circles in the air, a look on him she could not read from where she stood, not the cold transactional flatness he'd worn the day she came, but something quieter and more careful, the look of a man who has caught the land doing something he had stopped believing it could do. He did not speak of it. When he saw her, he settled his hat back on and went to his work, and the door of him swung shut. But he had taken to leaving a second lamp filled and trimmed on the kitchen table at night, where her brown ledger paper waited, and he had stopped, somewhere in those days, calling her the bee-woman, even in the flat way he'd first said it. He called her Miss Tarbox now, the 2 words plain and even in his low voice, and the first time Jess heard her father say it, the child looked up sharp from her candle mold, having heard, the way children hear, the whole unspoken weight a grown man hangs on a name. The clover on the bottom acres thickened toward its flood. The boxes filled with the low, full sound of a colony laying up stores. The ranch that had been dying so quietly that no one had thought to grieve it was, in the small, unhurried space of those stacking days, beginning without fuss or announcement to come back to life, and somewhere in town a well-fed man in a good gray hat was beginning to hear about it and to find that he did not care for the sound of a Roan ranch with money coming in. The good weeks did not last, and Nellie had been on the frontier long enough to know they never did. The honey was coming heavy now, the frames bowing pale and full when she lifted them to the light, and the rendered candles stood in their molds along the spring-house shelf like a quiet kind of money waiting to be spent. But on a bright, cold Tuesday, a buggy came down the Cedar Gap road, raising a thin tail of dust, and Nellie, straightening from the hive with her smoker still trailing, watched it slow and turn in at the Roan gate, and something in her shoulders went still the way it did before a storm she could smell but not yet see. Hollis Vane stepped down off the buggy in his good gray hat and his town suit, soft, pale hands working a pair of kid gloves off finger by finger, and he stood a moment in the yard looking the place over, the way a man looks over a horse he means to own. He was well-fed and well-dressed, and his smile arrived before he did, an easy banker's smile that warmed the lower half of his face and left the eyes cool and busy above it. Gideon came up bow-legged from the barn and put himself a little in front of nobody, just stood there with his tobacco-stained mustache working, and Silas came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves with that closed gray look fixed hard as a shut door. "Rowan," Vane said, pleasant, like they were old friends meeting at church. "I won't keep you. I never do." He turned the easy smile on the yard, on the mended fence, on the bees, and let it rest a beat on Nellie. "I see you've taken on help. Ambitious for a man in your circumstances." Nellie did not move from the hive. She had learned that men like this measured a person by whether they flinched, and she had stopped flinching for anybody a long time before she ever came to Cedar Gap. Vane drew a folded paper from his breast pocket, unhurried, the way a man draws a card he already knows will win. "The note, Silas," he said, and his voice stayed gentle, almost regretful, almost kind, and that was the worst of it, Nellie thought, that he could make ruin sound like a favor. "It came due the 1st of the month. I've carried it past out of respect for Ada's memory. God rest her. But the bank's the bank. I answer to it the same as you answer to the seasons." He let that sit. "I'm not an unreasonable man. I'd sooner see you walk away with something in your pocket than nothing at all. Sign the place over before the auction's called, and I'll see you're treated fair. Wait, and the court sells it off the block to the highest bidder, and you take what's left after the lawyers. There's no sentiment in a sheriff's sale, Silas. I'd spare you that." From the porch, Silas said nothing for a long moment, and Nellie watched the side of his face and saw something behind it adjust, some muscle in the jaw bank down a heat he would not show. "I'll have the money," Silas said at last, flat and even. "The wolves contracted. The cattle go to the Denver buyers come the drive." Vane's smile did not change, and that was how Nellie knew. It did not flicker, it did not falter, it only deepened a degree. The smile of a man who has already been where you are going and seen that the road is washed out. "Of course," he said. "Of course you'll try." He drew his gloves back on, finger by finger. "These are hard years for wool, hard years for beef. A man can have a fine clip and a fine herd and still find the price has moved against him by the time he gets to market. The world's a chancy place, Silas. I only hope it's kind to you." He climbed back into the buggy. As he gathered the reins, his gaze crossed Nellie one last time, weighing, and the soft mouth curved. "You'd want a lighter hand than that on a failing place, Roan," he said, mild as milk. "Folks in town are already calling her your fat bee woman. A man trying to save his name doesn't hire more for the county to laugh at." He clucked to the horse and was gone down the road in his thin tail of dust before Silas could answer. And the answer Silas might have made stayed locked behind his teeth where everything in him stayed. Gideon spat into the dirt and watched the dust settle. "Snake?" he said. "Polite snake, worst kind." He looked over at Nellie, and there was none of the old skepticism left in it, only a grim shared knowledge. "He don't say a thing he ain't already made true behind your back. You mark me. That talk about wool and beef moving against you, that weren't worry. That were a promise." Nellie set down her smoker and wiped her wide, strong hand slow on her canvas apron. She had heard the shape of it the way she heard a hive going queenless, by a wrongness under the ordinary hum. "He's already done something," she said. It was not a question. Gideon's bad knee took his weight as he turned toward the barn. 2 years I watched Silas claw at this place after Ida went. Vane held that note the whole time, quiet, friendly, patient as a buzzard. Then the day Silas starts coming back up, fences mended, bees working, the girl smiling again, that's the day he comes calling with the paper out. That ain't a banker. That's a man been waiting for the place to be worth taking. The wool went first, and it went the way Vane had promised, without ever quite promising it. The buyer who had contracted Silas's clip every spring for 9 years sent back word by a boy and a mule that he regretted, deeply regretted, but he would not be taking roan wool this season. After all, there had been talk, he wrote in a cramped, apologetic hand, talk of scab in the Cedar Gap flocks, talk of a poor grade, and a man in his position could not be too careful with his own buyers downstream. Silas read the note on the porch with the gray going harder in his face, and then he saddled up and rode the 11 miles into town to put his hand on the man's shoulder and ask him plain who had brought him that talk, and he came back at dark with the answer written in the set of his back. Nellie did not have to be told. There was scab in no flock on the Rowan place. The sheep were sound as church bells, and she had helped Gideon dose them herself against the very thing now being whispered as already done. Somebody had gone ahead of the truth and laid a lie down in its path, and the lie wore a good gray hat. Nellie watched Silas standing over the dozing pen in the gray morning, the sound sheep crowding warm and stupid and innocent against the rails, their breath smoking in the cold, and she watched him understand that being right would not save him, that a true clip could be killed by a false word as dead as if the scab had been real, and that there was no door in town he could knock on to make a buyer unhear a thing once it had been said to him soft and friendly over coffee. Then the cattle. The Denver buyers who came up the trail every season for the gathered herds let it be known gently through a third party that the roan cattle would be looked at last and bought cheapest, if bought at all, on account of uncertainty about the title. A man didn't want to pay top dollar for stock off a place that might be in the sheriff's hands by the fall, did he? The money tied up in courts for a year while the lawyers fed. The herd grazed fat and red on the good grass Silas had nursed back through 2 hard years. worth a fair price to any honest market, and worth half that now to the only market that would have them, all on the strength of a doubt that no one had put their name to. Every door Silas pushed had been oiled to swing shut quiet and slow ahead of his hand. None of it could be laid at Vane's feet. That was the genius of the man, and Nellie hated him for it, with a clean, cold steadiness that had no heat to burn itself out. Every blow came wrapped in a shrug, in market conditions, in talk that nobody could trace to a single mouth, in the regretful sympathy of men who were only being careful. He never lifted a hand. He only stood at the end of every road Silas could take and waited for him to arrive with empty pockets. By the second week, the thing had a date on it. The county posted the notice in town, and one was tacked by some clerk's idea of duty to the very board outside the Cedar Gap Mercantile where Nellie had first read the job that brought her here. Wild bees gone, room and board, no references required. And now, beside that faded card, a fresh white one announced the public sale of the Roan Ranch on the Cedar Gap Road, all lands, improvements, stock and chattels at auction, to satisfy a debt held by the Cedar Gap Bank. 6 weeks hence. Nellie stood in front of the board in town with her basket of candles on her arm, candles she had brought in to sell, and she read the notice through twice, and she felt the ground of the thing shift under her. This was no longer about whether the town laughed at the bee-woman, no longer about whether a cold widower would ever look at her with anything in his face. This was the land. This was Gideon's bad knees, and the only work left to him, and Jess's pale braids, and the only home she had ever known, and the barn with its rotting wall, and Ada's gone wild kitchen garden that Silas could not bear to clear, and the bees in their patient white boxes, and all of it going down under an auctioneer's hammer into Hollis Vane's soft, pale hands, while Vane stood at the back of the crowd in his good gray hat, looking regretful. 2 women passing behind her dropped their voices in the way that means a thing is meant to be overheard. That's her, the Roan Place's bee-woman. A small, mean laugh. Lord, look at the size of her. No wonder he's losing the ranch feeding that. Nellie did not turn around. She had learned the trick of letting such words pass through her like wind through netting, touching nothing. But her mind had already left them behind, gone elsewhere, gone to the things she had been turning over since the buggy raised its dust in the yard, because Nellie Tarbox had spent her whole life being overlooked, and overlooked people learned to see. While the men had been counting the ranch's worth in the 2 things Vane had reached out and quietly strangled, the wool and the cattle, the herd and the clip, the old reliable ledger lines every soul in the county knew how to value, not one of them had looked hard at the new thing, the bees. That night, by the lamp at the rough plank table, with Jess asleep, and Gideon gone to his bunk, and Silas a closed shape on the dark porch, Nellie spread out her papers, the same papers on which she had been balancing comb and wax and bloom and weather all these weeks, and she did the sum the way she did everything, slow and certain, without flinching from the answer, the honey already in the frames, racked and ripening, the fall flow still to come off the late bloom if the weather held, and her craftsman's rid said it would hold. The rendered wax, the candles, the salve, a clean second crop the cattleman never reckoned, because no cattleman ever thought to. She had the freight figured and the market figured. She knew what honey fetched in Denver, where the rich houses wanted it for their tables, knew what good beeswax candles brought, where tallow stank and the better folk would pay not to smell it, knew the druggist's price for salve a man could trust. She added it down the column twice, and then a third time, because a thing this size you did not trust on two passes. The number at the bottom was not a fortune, but it sat there on the paper, plain and stubborn and real, and it was enough. With 6 weeks and a strong harvest and a fair sale, the honey gold could cover the note. It was the one ledger line on the whole failing place that Hollis Vane had not thought to poison, because he, like all of them, had looked at the bee-woman and seen only her size and seen nothing of her worth. She sat very still with that knowing, the lamp guttering low, and then a second cold clarity settled over the first. A man like Vane did not leave a gap on purpose. He had simply not seen it yet. And a man who had lied scab into a sound flock and doubt into a clean title would not sit on his soft hands once he understood that a fat bee-woman's honey could pull the note out from under him at the last hour. The moment Vane learned the bees could pay, he would find a way to see them ruined, too. A buyer warned off, a road to market gone bad, a fire some night that nobody could quite lay at his feet. So Nellie did not go waken the house with her good news. She had been laughed at long enough to know that the surest way to lose a thing was to wave it where the wrong man could see. Instead, she began, quietly, the way she did all her best work, to gather. She kept her own true ledger of the harvest, every frame and pound and price, written plain so that no man could call it a woman's hopeful guessing, proof of the bee's worth, set down in figures a court or a bank could not wave away. And she began just as quietly to gather the other thing. The boy on the mule who had carried the wool buyer's lie still owed her a candle and a kindness, and boys talk. The mercantile clerk who tacked the notices heard which town men took breakfast with Vane and which way the talk ran out of his mouth. The sheep were sound, and she had the dosing dates and Gideon's word to swear they were never otherwise. She carried her candles into the mercantile and the druggist's and the kitchens of the better houses, and she listened the whole time she sold, because a heavy plain woman selling honest goods at a fair price was so far beneath the notice of the men who ran the county that they talked over her head as though she were a post, and she let them, and she remembered every word. She learned which day Vane had taken his coffee with the wool buyer, and that it was the very morning before the boy on the mule rode out with the regretful note. She learned that the third party who had carried the cattle down to the Denver men was a clerk who banked his small wages where Vane sat on the board. She learned that a sound flock had never once in 9 years been called scabby until the season the roan place started to climb. None of it, by itself, was a hanging rope, but laid down side by side in her plain, slow hand, the dates began to line up like frames in a hive, each one fitting snug against the next, and the shape they made was the shape of one man's patient hand moving behind everything. A thread here, a name there, a date that did not match the story being told. Nellie pulled them in slow and patient and let no one see her doing it. A broad-backed woman with a basket of candles and a way of being underestimated that had finally, for the first time in her life, become the most useful thing she owned. Out on the dark porch, the coal of Silas's pipe glowed and dimmed, and once Nellie looked up from her papers and found him watching her through the open door, the lamplight between them, a look she could not read across that distance, whether it was a drowning man's hope or only the last suspicion of a man with nothing left to lose, she could not have said. She bent back to her column of figures. There was work to do, and not much time, and she had never in her life been afraid of work. The day the note came due was set for a Saturday, and Vane had been careful to let everyone in Cedar Gap know it. The way a man rings a bell so the whole town turns to watch the thing he means to do. Nellie heard of the date the way she heard of most things now, with her hands busy and her face still, and she did not argue it, and she did not waste an hour of it. What the town did not know, what Vane in his good gray hat did not know, was that while he had spent his weeks pressing and smiling and quietly turning buyers away from Silas's wool and Silas's cattle, the bee-woman had spent hers building. She had not built in a panic. She had built the way she did everything, slow and certain, one true thing set down beside the next. And now, in the last days before the reckoning, all those small set-down things stood up together and showed what they were. The apiary along the south fence line had come into its strength. The skeps she had wound, and the framed hives she had knocked together out of barn salvage and clean pine, ran in a tidy row down the warm side of the slope, every one of them heavy, every one of them roaring soft and content in the cold, bright mornings, and inside them was the whole season's gold. She and Gideon had been pulling frames for a week, the old man's tobacco-stained mustache working with concentration as he held the smoker the way she taught him, no longer afraid, proud now, careful as a deacon with the plate. They cut the comb in the cleaned-out spring-house where it was cool and dim, and the smell of it filled the whole hollow, that heavy gold smell that had first reached Nellie out on the road. Only now it was not leaking from a ruin. It was pouring from a place she had made. The honey came off the comb in slow ropes the color of late sun, dropping thick and unhurried into the crock with a sound like the last of warm rain off an eave. Jar after jar after jar lined the spring-house shelves, until the shelves would hold no more, and they went to crates, and the crates ran too deep along the cool stone wall, and Gideon shook his head over them, and allowed, low, that he'd worked this country 40 year and never seen the like come off any one place in a season, let alone off a barn. Folks had rode off for kindling. She worked the comb with her strong hand, sure and gentle, never crushing what she could lift whole, setting the empty frames back clean for the bees to draw again, wasting nothing, the way a woman works who has gone without and knows exactly what a thing is worth. She rendered the wax in a kettle over a low fire, skimming and straining it through a square of clean muslin twice over, until it ran clear and gold as a coin, and poured it warm into the candle molds and the flat tins of salve she had cut with beeswax, and rendered tallow, and a little of the dried bloom she gathered off the high meadow in the good weeks, and saved against this, and the smell of the warm wax laid itself over the honey smell, until the whole hollow was thick and sweet with it, a smell of plenty in a place that 2 seasons running had smelled only of dust and given up. And Jess sat beside her through all of it now, the wary, closed-off child who had once been stung and frightened of the very hum of the hives gone soft and busy and unafraid. Her dead mother's pale hair in its 2 thin braids bent over the work, trimming wicks with her small careful fingers and pinching them straight and lining the cooled candles up in rows and counting them out loud. 20 and 20 more, and laughing once. A small startled sound, like the laugh had got out before she remembered she didn't do that any more, when a fat, slow bee crawled up onto the back of her hand and sat there warming itself and did not sting her, and she held it up to show Nellie brave as anything, and Nellie said only, "She knows whose house this is now," and went on pouring. It was the biggest harvest Nellie had ever taken in her life, bigger than she had let herself hope for standing on that rise the first day, and she knew exactly what it was worth, because she had been figuring it on paper the whole season long, in the deep pockets of her apron, in a stub of pencil and a folded sheet, gone soft at the creases, every comb and candle and tin set down in her square plain hand, and totaled again until the number at the bottom was a thing she could hold up to the daylight without flinching. But Nellie Tarbox was too good a hand to trust a harvest alone against a man like Hollis Vane, and that was the part the town never saw coming, because the town had decided long ago what a big sun-browned woman in a patched dress could and could not be, and not one of them had thought to put cunning on the list. She had watched Vane all season, the way she watched weather, quiet and steady, and giving away nothing, and she had seen the pattern in him before she had words for it, the way the buyer from Pueblo had ridden out to look at Silas's wool and ridden off again without an offer, the way the cattle broker had gone suddenly cold, the way every door that should have opened for the Roan place had been eased shut just ahead of them by a soft, pale hand. So she had begun, without telling a soul but Gideon, to gather, not to fight him with fists or fire, which was what such men always braced for and always beat. She gathered the one thing a smiling man in a town suit could not smile away, and that was the plain-written truth in other men's own hands. There was the teamster who hauled freight on the Cedar Gap Road and owed Silas an old kindness, and bore Vane a fresh grudge, and he set his mark to a paper saying he'd been paid by Vane to carry word to the Pueblo buyer that the Roan wool was poxed, and the Roan title was clouded, and a wise man would keep his money in his pocket. There was the clerk at the bank, a thin, nervous young fellow whose conscience Nellie had read as easily as she read a hive coming queenless, and over 2 quiet conversations and a tin of her salve for his cracked winter hands, he had told her, and then written down and signed, that the note Vane held had been bought up cheap and called early and called hard, for no reason but to break a grieving man loose from his land. There was a market trader down from the county seat who'd watched Vane lean on the cattle broker in the open street, lean on him soft and smiling the way Vane leaned on everybody, and the trader had a long memory and no love for the man, and was willing to say so on paper and put his name under it. Nellie had not gone at any of them hard. She had not needed to. She had only sat with each one the way she sat with a nervous hive, slow and easy, and giving them time to settle and let them come to her, and what came was the truth, because the truth was already in them and only wanted a steady hand to draw it out. She had read men the way she read bees the whole of her hard life, who was about to bolt and who was about to sting, and who only wanted permission to do the right thing, and she read these 3 true. None of it was loud. There were no threats in it, and no lies, and nothing a court could throw out or a clever man could twist. Just 3 plain accounts in 3 working men's own hands of what a smiling banker had done in the dark, and all of it was signed, and Nellie carried the little sheaf of it folded flat against the honey tally in her apron pocket like a second harvest, the kind a man could not see coming and could not buy his way out of once it stood up in the light. The other half she carried in crates. The week before the note came due, she had loaded the wagon before dawn. Her and Gideon and a silent watching Silas heaving the heavy crates up over the wheel, jar after jar of clear gold honey, box after box of clean amber candles, the flat tins of salve stacked tight, and she had driven it not to a back door, but straight into the middle of Cedar Gap on market morning, into the same town that had stood in that street and called her the Fat Bee Woman. And she had set up her board in the open and opened the crates and let the smell do the first of her arguing. The smell reached them before the talk did. That heavy gold honey smell rolled down the cold street and through the open mercantile door and into the church porch, where the women gathered, and folks who had not meant to stop stopped, and folks who had laughed at her drifted over with their hands in their pockets to see. She let them. She stood square behind her board, broad and unhurried, her strong hands lifting a jar to the light so the gold of it caught the morning, and she did not crow and she did not beg. She just set the truth of the work out where their eyes and their noses could not call it a lie. A woman tasted the honey off a wooden spoon and went still and tasted it again. A rancher's wife, who'd had a winter of split and bleeding hands, worked a little of the salve into them and stood there flexing her fingers with a look on her face like something had been given back to her. The candles burned cleaner and longer and sweeter than the smoking tallow dips the mercantile sold, and a man held one up and turned it and asked Lo what she wanted for the lot. By the middle of the morning, the same mouths that had mocked her were leaning in to buy, and there was a small press of people 3 deep at her board, and the mercantile man himself, the one who had told her on her first day that there was no money out there to pay anybody, came across the street wiping his hands on his apron and made her an offer for her whole steady supply, the honey and the wax both, season after season. More money laid out plain on the boards in front of the watching town than Silas Roan's wool and cattle would have fetched in a fat year, let alone this lean one. Honey gold, somebody said, half a joke, looking at the jars catching the sun, and the name stuck the way true names do, and it was not a joke any more. Nellie did the figuring in her head against the figuring already on the soft paper in her pocket, and the 2 numbers met and shook hands, and she knew before she signed her name to the mercantile man's book that the thing was done. The note could be paid. Not begged off, not borrowed against not put off another season into another man's mercy, paid in full, in honest coin, earned out of a barn everyone had given up for dead, by the woman everyone had given up on in the same breath. She did not gloat, and she did not run home with it. She finished her market like a tradesman, took her orders and her coin and her promises, and wrote each one down, and only when the crates were empty and the board folded did she climb back up onto the wagon. Vane was there by then, of course, standing at the edge of the crowd in his good gray hat, with that easy banker's smile that never once reached his eyes, watching his whole patient season come apart in the open street. And when she came down off the market, he stepped near and spoke to her low and reasonable, the way he always did, the way a man does when he still believes his voice is the strongest thing in the room. "You've had a good morning," he said, pleasant as church. "A clever morning. But a pile of pennies from candle stubs and a fat woman's honey is one thing, Miss Tarbox, and a banked and lawful note is another, and the note is mine, and it comes due Saturday whatever you've sold off aboard in the road." He let the smile sit. "Tell Roan I'll want the place broom clean." Nellie looked at him the way she'd looked at the swarm that first day, unflinching, certain of the bottom under her feet, and she did not raise her voice either. "The note'll be paid Saturday, Mr. Vane," she said, "in full in front of whoever wants to watch. You'll take the money because it's lawful, and you've got no ground to stand on to refuse it." And then, plainly, not as a threat, but as a fact, set down beside the others. "And the morning you take it, there's some papers going to be read out loud in front of the same folks, what you paid the teamster to tell Pueblo, and why that note got bought cheap and called early, and what you said to the cattle broker in this street where men could hear. Signed papers, Mr. Vane, in other men's hands, not mine." She watched it land. She had promised herself she would not enjoy it, and she did not, quite. But she watched it land all the same, watched the easy banker's smile try to hold its shape and fail, watched the soft, pale hands go still at his sides, watched the color of a man who has just understood that the slow, stupid thing he stepped over in the road had been measuring him the whole time. He was too smooth to sputter and too cornered to lie, and a smiling man without his smile is only a frightened one in a good hat. He understood, the way such men always understand in the end, that a public reading of those papers would cost him a great deal more in that county than one failing ranch was worth, that the buyers he leaned on would not lean for him again, that the bank that had let him call the note would not want its name beside his when it was read aloud, that a man who trades on being plausible cannot afford the day the town stops finding him so. He weighed it the way he weighed everything, coldly and fast, and he came out where Nellie had known a careful man must come out. He did not rage, he did not make a speech. That was not his kind. He only let a small silence go by, and tipped the good gray hat a half-inch with one soft hand, and said, in the same reasonable voice gone suddenly thin, "I see I've misjudged the situation." And what he meant was that he had misjudged her, and they both knew it. And he turned and walked back up the street the way a man walks, who is already deciding which town to be plausible in next. He took the note's payment Saturday because it was lawful and there was no help for it, counted out in honey-gold coin on the bank's own counter with half of Cedar Gap crowded in to see. And he signed the note, paid and clear, in his own neat hand. And he did not look at Nellie when he did it. By the time the ink was dry, he was gone from the country, and the papers never had to be read aloud after all, though Nellie kept them folded soft in her apron, just the same, because a good hand keeps her tools even after the swarm is hived. And in the bank that morning, with the note marked paid, and the threat that had hung over the dying ranch lifted off it all at once like weather breaking, Silas Roan stood beside her and looked at her. And this time Nellie did not have to read him through a shut door. Whatever had been bolted behind that gray, level face since the day she walked up his road came unbolted in front of the whole town, slow, the way ice goes off a pond, and he looked at her fully, not at the size of her that the county had made its cruel joke of, not at the patched dress or the strong white arms, but at her, at the whole steady, cunning, capable worth of her that he had been watching come clearer all season and had not let himself name. The town saw it too, the same mouths softened now to respect, pressing in not to mock the bee woman, but to shake her strong hand and ask after her honey and her candles, and whether she'd take their orders come spring. But Nellie hardly marked them. She was watching Silas watch her, and reading at last, plain as a comb held to the light, the thing she had not let herself hope for any more than she'd let herself hope for the harvest, that something behind that closed face had not just adjusted, but opened, and that the man who had promised her nothing on his porch but a roof and a chance was looking at her now like a man who had just understood, 2 years too late to say it easy, that the thing he had needed gone was never the bees at all. It was Silas who came to find her on the ridge the evening the last of it settled. The deal was struck, the buyers paid in town, the wagons gone back down the Cedar Gap road with the season's honey gold packed in their beds, and Hollis Vane had taken his good gray hat and his soft pale hands and his banker's smile off the roan place for the last time, the called note bought clean out from under him by a record harvest he had been so sure could never come. Nellie had walked up to the high ground above the apiary to watch the light go, the way she did most evenings now, and she heard his boots in the dry grass before she turned, and she knew the step. She had learned the whole vocabulary of this ranch by now, the creak of the porch, Gideon's bow-legged shuffle, Jess's quick light run, and she knew Silas Roan's tread the way she knew the hum of a hive that was content. He came up beside her and stopped, and for a long while he said nothing, and she let him, because she had learned that too. Silence was a thing this man wore the way he wore the duster, and she had stopped trying to fill it weeks ago. Below them, the rows of skeps and white frames sat quiet in the dusk. The bees gone in for the night. A low, steady drone rising off the boxes, like the place itself, breathing easy. The corral down past the house held more head than it had held in years, fat and slow against the rail, and the wool had gone to market clean and whole this season, no buyer scared off, no sale quietly poisoned, because the smooth man who had done the poisoning had run out of ways to do it. The dead garden was dead no longer. Jess had taken to it with Nellie's hand to guide her, and the squared beds Ada Roan had laid out and left were green again in their old careful rows, as if the careful hand had only stepped away a moment and come back. Silas looked at all of it a long time. He had watched her build every piece of it. The skeps coiled out of straw by the kitchen fire, the frames squared with the last good lumber, the wax come amber and clean off the rendering pot. The figures she penciled by lamplight, reckoning what the comb might fetch, and he had said almost nothing through any of it, only watched. And now he looked at all of it the way a man looks at his own life handed back to him whole, and could not seem to find where to set his eyes. Then he looked at her. "You meant to leave once the bees were out of the wall," he said. It was not a question. He had never once asked her to stay, not in all the weeks, not when Gideon thawed, nor when the child climbed into her lap over a comb of honey, nor when the harvest came in gold and saved the whole of it. He had only watched her, that closed gray door of a face, and she had read what she could from the porch and let the rest alone. But here, on the ridge, with the light going amber and low across the both of them, something behind his face finally came unbolted, and she watched it open the way she'd watched 100 guarded things, gentle to her hand, slow and certain, and from the inside, and for the first and only time since she had walked up his road, The door he kept stood open long enough for her to see clean through it. There was Ada in there, 2 years dead of the fever, and the garden he had not been able to look at, and the long-shut grief of a man who had decided somewhere in the worst of it that wanting a thing was only another way of losing it. There was the fear, plain as the rest, that she would do what everything good in his life had done, which was to leave, and under all of it, held down hard for weeks behind that level gray, there was the thing he had not let himself name even to himself, that he did not want her to go. 2 years of grief he had not named stood plain in his eyes now, and beside it something newer and more frightening to him than grief, and he did not flinch from her seeing either one. "I meant to," Nellie said, "before I knew the place. And now." It was still not a question that second time. It was a man laying the last thing he had down in front of her and not daring to call it by its name. The wind off the high country moved a loose strand of sandy hair across her face, come free of the faded calico kerchief, and Silas Roan lifted one weather-cut hand, the same hand that had stayed shut at his side the day she walked up his road wanting only a roof, and he tucked the strand back gently behind her ear. That was all. That was the whole of it. His fingers were rough, and they shook the smallest amount, and they were warm against her temple, and a man who had given the world nothing for 2 years gave her that, and Nellie Tarbox, whom the county had called too much of everything, stood very still under the size of it. "Yes," she said. He had not asked. She answered him anyway, because she had heard the question he could not make his mouth shape, and it lived in the half-inch his hand had crossed, and in the breath he was not quite taking, and her yes closed that last distance the way the swarm had once come down out of the furious air and settled soft onto her sleeve, not captured, not commanded, but come home, of its own will, to the one steady place that had stood still long enough to be trusted. Something behind his face eased and held, and did not shut again. They were married before the first frost. In the mended kitchen with the garden green outside the window, Gideon scrubbed and grinning under his tobacco-gray mustache, and standing up for Silas, the way an old man stands up for a son, and Jess in a clean dress with her pale braids done careful, holding a fistful of asters. She had grown herself, and watching Nellie with none of the wariness left in her at all, only the plain open trust of a child who had decided this was her mother now, and meant to keep her. The note was paid. The hives were humming. The barn that had leaned and rotted and roared out a black storm of wild bees the day Nellie first walked into the yard was rebuilt square and sound by spring, and the wild hive in its wall was moved gentle into good white boxes, so that the same bees that had once sent grown men crawling in the dust now worked the bloom in long, bright lines over a ranch come fully back to life. And the sound that rolled off the Roan place in the warm months was no longer a barn full of fury, but an apiary full of plenty, the same 10,000 small bodies, the same deep hum, turned all the way around from menace to belonging, the way the whole of it had turned. They called the Honey Heartland Gold at the Cedar Gap Market, and it carried the Roan name out farther than the man or the land ever had. Jar after amber jar of it sold off the long market tables, the candles, and the salve beside it that Nellie's hands rendered down each winter at the kitchen fire with Jess, and in the later years, with children of her own, underfoot. The salve went into the rough hands of half the county before long, and the candles burned in windows clear to the high country, and the mercantile man who had once told her there was no money out at the Roan place to pay anybody learned to set her honey at the front of his store where the light caught it. She lived a long life on that ridge, and a well-loved one. She grew old, broad-backed, and strong-handed, and sure, never once flinching, the bee-woman who had walked into the cloud and stayed, and the county that had called her too much of everything, learned in time to call her by her name, Nellie Rowan now, and then to send for her when their own hives went wild and their own hard men stood back helpless from the cloud, and she would come slow and certain with her smoker and her netting and her two strong arms, and bring the fury down a half-tone and a half-tone more, the way she always had. She taught a whole generation of girls thereabouts to read the bloom in the weather and to render the wax clean, and to stand still while 10,000 furious things decided to come home. And more than one of them grew up to keep bees of her own, and to remember when the town said some woman was too much of something, the big, calm woman who had been told the same and had been exactly enough. Silas Rowan's gray eyes never closed against her again. He learned to talk in the evenings a little, slow as everything in him came, and he learned to laugh once or twice a year, which Gideon swore was a miracle he had never thought to live and see. Gideon was buried in time on the high ground above the apiary, by his own asking, where he could hear the boxes hum, and Nellie planted asters over him so the bees would always have a reason to come. And on the soft evenings, year after year, when the light went amber and low across the both of them, as it had that first time on the ridge, Nellie would stand above the white rose with the man she had healed by simply not leaving, his shoulder against hers, and the whole humming length of the place spread out below them, and she would listen to it breathe easy and know it for hers. The barn no longer leaned, the bees no longer raged. The same deep hum that had once been a black roar boiling out of a rotting wall, that had sent grown men crawling in the dust the day she first walked in among them, rose now off the boxes, soft as a hymn. 10,000 small bodies, content in the work, come home and kept. The whole of it turned all the way around, from menace to belonging, from a thing the world ran from to a thing the world came to her to learn. A roof and a chance. That was all she had ever asked for once, on a cold road with two strong arms and nothing else to her name. The land gave it back to her in honey gold, and went on giving it every season of a long and gentle life for the rest of her days.